Although Katherine Pierce mainly served as a supporting antagonist, constantly lingering in the background of the narrative on the Vampire Diaries, she is undoubtedly one of the most loved characters within the series. Katherine's popularity seems to be pretty disproportionate to her actual role in the show, and it's interesting to consider exactly why that may be. Obviously, well-developed villainous characters always tend to have a significant fanbase, and in many cases, it seems like it's much easier to sell the audience at large on an evil character rather than a good one. But what made Katherine so appealing in particular? Undoubtedly, she isn't a flawless character, and many of her interactions with Stefan, Damon, and many of the other characters that she used or seduced could be considered problematic. And making one of the ultimate TVD villains a classic femme fatale wasn't a wonderful choice either. However, Katherine is undeniably one of the most unique characters in the Vampire Diaries universe, and that might explain why she resonates so well with viewers in general. The Vampire Diaries is a show that blends horror and romance, and it doesn't always do so in the most graceful or seamless of ways. And it's fascinating that Katherine's Black Widow-type persona was largely created around the conception of Elena's character, i.e., she was made into a compassionless, overtly sexy, and entirely self-serving character simply because they wanted her to completely contrast with their idea of Elena as a compassionate, virginally unattainable, and pathologically self-sacrificing character. They wanted to make it as clear as possible that Elena is the infallible heroine, while Katherine is the perpetually fallible villain. But upon further examination, it's not at all surprising that Katherine was such a hit with viewers, to the point where she may have outshone her leading lady doppelganger in the eyes of most of the audience. Because Katherine essentially goes against TVD's ideals of what a woman should be, which means that there really isn't another major character like her in the story. Obviously, this isn't just a problem with the Vampire Diaries, but TVD has a very strong preference for creating heroic female characters whose heroism seems to revolve around completely putting others before themselves at all times. And it also has a consistent habit of shaming female characters whose romantic interests don't fall into the acceptable parameters for a guy who they should be willing to die for. And make no mistake, a huge reason why Katherine is meant to be perceived as villainous is specifically because she directly goes against many of these ideals. However, what's interesting is that this might be the exact reason why so many viewers enjoy her character so much. The trope of a good woman who proves her virtue by essentially becoming a meat shield for the people around her is an unfortunately common one in mainstream media, as is the idea that for most women, gaining the love of a man is the most important thing that will ever happen to them, and they should be willing to sacrifice anything in order to keep it. And although the complexity of female characters has increased on the whole for the past decade or so, it was even less common to see fictional TV women who flew in the face of these ideals in the past than it is now. Which in many ways makes Katherine Pierce a very unusual character that many girls and women would understandably be drawn towards. Because, despite the fact that Katherine is supposed to be the ultimate evil in the eyes of the narrative, there are characteristics that she embodies that conflict with the main female characters in the best ways. For instance, Elena, Bonnie, and Caroline seem to be more passive participants in the plot rather than active. Yes, they all have their roles to play, but despite their own power or intelligence, they are typically just players in the game, rather than the masterminds of what's going on. In contrast, Katherine isn't just the one controlling the entire chessboard. Every piece on that board is under her influence or control, even if they're fighting against her. In contrast to her doppelganger Elena, who willingly sacrifices herself to Klaus to keep her friends and family safe, a decision which unfortunately doesn't even work, Katherine does everything that she can to survive. Not only does she fight for her own survival over those around her, but she herself becomes the engineer of her own plots against Klaus, and manages to do a pretty bang-up job at eluding him, despite the fact that, in theory, she should be powerless against him. And, in comparison to the main female characters, who all seem to be willing to fall on the sword for men that they love, even when those men objectively suck, or don't love them back, Katherine has many men wrapped around her finger, but wouldn't sacrifice herself for love. And even more interestingly, it's not as if she's portrayed as a character who is incapable of love. What makes her so fantastic is that she simply prioritizes her own well-being over love. These characteristics all radically differentiate Katherine from most of the female characters on TVD, and it largely distinguished her from many other female characters in TV and film at the time. But that is very likely one of the major reasons that she was so appealing. Not only was she the polar opposite of what a good woman was supposed to be, but she wholeheartedly embraced it and didn't apologize for her own self-serving choices. Katherine's lack of morality is meant to indicate that she's evil, but it's actually one of the most interesting aspects of her character. It's not as if she doesn't understand the difference between right and wrong, but ethics simply have no influence on Katherine's decisions when it comes to her goals. She's the consummate unapologetic survivalist. She will do anything she has to in order to preserve herself, even though she doesn't necessarily think that she deserves it. Surprisingly, she seems to have the most insight into the moral spectrum that she's dealing with in the Vampire Diaries universe. Because, while many of the protagonists arbitrarily kill and justify it to themselves, and even differentiate themselves as good people fighting against the bad guys, Katherine makes no claims of moral superiority and simply does what's in her best interest. But it's not just understandable that so many viewers should be drawn to Katherine because of these traits. In many ways, she's actually one of the more admirable characters that the audience should be inspired by. Because, her career as a killer notwithstanding, many of the beliefs and ideals that Katherine holds herself to are actually better than those of the supposedly good female characters that are represented in every corner of media. Katherine's popularity is likely related to some kind of wish fulfillment, because most people would love to be intelligent, in control, looking out for themselves, and completely unashamed of it. But these behaviors, especially when they're exhibited by women, are shamed and considered to be morally reprehensible. So, to see Katherine be so unapologetically herself, even if she's portrayed as the villain because of it, is actually bizarrely inspiring. Katherine is often reproached for her treatment of men in the narrative, but an obvious question is, why? Many of the men that she seems to become involved with, Damon and Stefan in particular, aren't very good people. Elena is meant to be applauded because she puts herself in harm's way in order to keep them on the straight and narrow. But why should she? Clearly, the show is intending to imply that Elena is the better woman because she will burn to keep her boyfriends warm. But that is an objectively terrible message to be sending, and it's actually a little relieving that Katherine's popularity over Elena seems to indicate that it was a message that the audience didn't want to receive. And like every other character, there were instances where the show did Katherine dirty, making her into the comic relief character who had a fatal attraction-level obsession with Stefan after she became human was an absolutely bizarre misstep that really undermined what made her so fantastic as a villain, and as a complex female character overall. However, within a show that idealizes female sacrifice and treats the suffering of women as somehow heroic, Katherine was one of the very few representations of the exact opposite. And it's fascinating that despite the point of view of the narrative itself, many of the show's viewers seem to pick up on that. But what do you think? Is Katherine a popular character because she's actually willing to prioritize herself over others? Is it simply because she's a powerful mastermind? Or is it something else? Leave your thoughts and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.